Oh my.
We went to the Canadian Rockies, Yellowstone and the Canadian Rockies. It was, I've been across the border to Canada, but wow,
Yeah.
that was amazing.
How far north did you go?
We went, I think Jasper was probably about as far north as we went. We went with the loop, Calgary, Jasper, Kamloops, Kelowna, where the big fire was. They closed the highway after we went left. And down to, Banff.
How you doing, Mickey?
And we
Very
went
good.
to Vancouver. We didn't do, would have been nice.
How are you all?
Yeah.
Well, the reason we did Victoria, that's where we went out of.
Yeah.
But we did just the road trip up to Jasper, Calgary Stampede, and.
Did you go to Calgary Stampede?
Yes. Now, I'm not
Good morning.
that type of person, but my son,
How you doing, Steve?
okay,
Oh,
I'm sure he does
how
things.
can you're a
But
Christian?
I really, they have a
Born in the
rodeo in
USA?
the afternoon.
Bad.
Chuck wagon races that
You're
night, and I really enjoyed it.
I agree with that.
After that, they have fantastic music.
Alex name's over your way.
You know, I love Calgary.
Something?
Hey, good morning.
They showed us where they have that stuff.
They kept saying, everybody goes through Calgary. I'm taking your tissue.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Don't take mine.
Somebody get here.
Grab, where's my?
Need somebody else's chair.
Yeah.
I'll grab it.
They're both good.
Somebody used our area and rearranged the.
I got to the fall
She
on.
doesn't want to 'cause she likes it.
It's cold.
I think I'd rather be at
So she ran up home and stuff.
second.
Yep. There you go.
Come on, cheers. Well, right below some fan and cooling train,
Although it's,
they got there and shredded
yeah.
the belt.
Flew in the buildings, so when we flew
We
out.
got a guy that helps us well. Do you want some tissues? We got-
Oh, there's a box down here.
You gotta have.
There's a box down. I'll just slide it over, Mick. I'm good.
You okay?
Yeah.
You're kind of scowling there.
So we called it the boat.
Having a day.
We got it over. Finally got it finished. And that was really producing. It wasn't up to him to put that in. Yeah.
I don't remember what day it came.
I know. If you go to apple.com, they have what's called authorized devices. There's a list there. And you can see which ones, if anybody's.
I think it happened because it asked me.
Get outside and sweat it out today.
Which is real old. And
Right.
So I said, yes, and that, I didn't start to make more stuff.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then I said, oh, say,
Yeah. Right.
I got to get this neighbor in to sit up there. I did.
Right.
You know, they send some every 50 days.
Right.
I mean, you know, you always ask, of all the things they listed, the one that we just I'm only on Facebook. They listed they had a bunch of other stuff. These are the most common. And now 6 of them, I was only on Facebook. That's probably that.
Yeah, take it.
Instagram.
How's everybody? Another exciting day. Never bored. Never bored, not since I had kids. Yeah. There's always something to do or somebody to pay attention to. Yes. If there's no noise being made, that's what we were. Yes.
Ours is whistling all over the house and making batteries. We got no key.
Kids love white noise. They have to make it or hear it.
It's not even like.
Yeah. Just random sound. Yeah.
Attitude, there's like no musicality to it.
Seems to let off the clutch.
It's funny.
We don't have a limit.
Let's go outside and whistle.
Yes, he was outside away from my house.
And you will probably notice that he doesn't do that.
Well, he's doing
The whole point is, to some degree, just constant attention. Yeah.
irritation.
Lane's or Luke's that way.
How's,
Kids.
you said, how's his truck driving going?
Well, he's not doing truck driving right now. He's actually home. Hopefully, we'll see him here today. So he hit a deer on the way home last night. Yeah, the star looks like that's a black eye. There's just a missing headlamp assembly. Big crunched hood, but it still drives. He said, well, we're just going to get a really big rubber mallet and bang things back into shape, and put a new headlight assembly in, and off you go.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Just come home for a day or two. Yeah, that's all. Yeah. Hit a deer on the way. Friend? Yeah, good deal. You're ahead of the game. Okay. How you doing, Jake?
We all right.
Pretty all right. Okay. It was 3 syllables.
That's 4 syllables.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yep.
Your proteges prove it wrong.
Normally.
That's where I get them in.
You know what they say, you fail up, right?
I redid some of it. But he can do a little more to it.
Anything on your mind, friend? Karen, are you parking here?
Yeah,
Very good. How about you? It's still running now.
Fence stretcher, you know.
No, not running.
I guess
It's still running.
so I told her, I put one of them on there for a lot easier. So put that on there. If it wouldn't raise the fire, that's what I wanted, you know. Extend it up. And just one thing. I got it all done. What?
The fence you're talking about fixing, that's not wire, that's.
Well, some of it's cattle, some of it's,
Hey, Pete. Hey, Pete.
My body could do better.
outside fences,
Yeah,
you know, 5/8 borders.
chain link. Oh,
It's squares and well,
Sure, it's not just me.
in 3 pieces.
oh,
I got that size.
yeah.
Well, if you need that, I'll be a volunteer, okay?
Okay.
Morning, morning.
I got tomatoes, guess what?
All right.
If anybody wants some, there's plenty.
Okay.
Cherry tomatoes.
Oh, I can do that.
We've been eating.
How about you guys?
Thank you.
We've been swimming in tomatoes ourselves.
Yep. Put them on the counter. I'll grab it. Thank you. That's about it.
Good.
I like it.
Anyway.
Yeah, they're kind of changed a little bit. I don't know. I mean, he's like, this one I got.
Wasn't me.
We had the meeting in here.
There was a group of government officials and others that were involved in that.
They'll put things back like they found.
Yeah. The catastrophe that happened, you know, the girl who died.
Hand to God.
What was it? What do you?
Some government officials.
I'm good, thank you. How are you guys?
Got some?
How you this morning?
I'm here. Hey.
Welcome, welcome. Where are you sitting? Right there? In the danger zone where I sit? Okay. All right. Well, good morning, friends. It's good to see all of you. We are in Romans chapter 4, if you want to turn there. Whew. Romans chapter 4. Well, I attempted to change out the strut assemblies on the back of my car. And I say attempted because 5 hours in, I thought I wasn't going to make it. And then the Lord was kind and clued me in as to what I was doing wrong, and got done, and it all works. And I enjoy a challenge. I enjoy trying something I've never tried before and see if I can figure it out. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail. And I feel like here in Romans chapter 4, Paul was trying, before he was a Christian, when he was a Jew, when he was a Pharisee, he was trying to justify himself to God through works of the law. And he failed. But then the Lord clued him in, and he figured out that it's by faith, not by works. And that allowed him to succeed. And that's the argument he's going to make to us here today, is that Israel was always justified by faith when they looked forward to the Messiah to come. But they could not justify themselves by merely following rules. And I think to this day, there's a lot of people who are confused about this and don't understand it. So I want to have a conversation about it. So if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. But just a real quick review at the top of your sheet here. Circumcision, or any outward sign, was never what was justified Israel to God. By the time Jesus came, remember that the people were convinced that they were saved simply because they were from Abraham. Like, that's it. It just came down to ethnicity. And that's never true in the Old Testament. It was a man-made law at that point. And so that's what we talked about a couple weeks ago. And again, it was actually by faith. God provided them the Messiah to come. That was what they were to look forward to. They obeyed him in the meantime. And then through grace, they were saved. Well, quick review number 2. And this is just important for today's discussion. The law's purpose was twofold. The law had two purposes. One was to demonstrate that no one could live up to it. There's over 660 laws in the Old Testament, and nobody can keep them all, except for Jesus. And the second purpose of the law was to point to Christ who would come. Otherwise, the law was not designed to save. It was actually designed to condemn. It was designed to show us that we were dependent on God to provide what we needed, and what we needed was Christ. So with that, we can start our study. So if somebody would read Romans chapter 4, verses 13 to 14.
For the promise to Abraham or to his heir to the world was not through the law, but through righteousness and faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is nullified.
Okay, thank you, Jim. If the law was the way we could be saved, not just the law of Moses, but any law, any set of laws was how we could be saved, then our faith, our obedience is made void, because all you have to do is break one law. You don't have to break 660 laws, or Lord knows how many laws we have in this country now. You can't keep them all. And you're not justified by that, because once you break one, you've broken the law, and that's it. And the reason why that really matters is because God is perfect. So any degree of imperfection at all, and you're no longer able to be in his presence. He is perfect, and he is morally just, and he is perfectly merciful and perfectly just. And so we know that the wages of sin is death. So one sin, the wage is death, taking away of life. And Romans 3:23, all have fallen short of the glory of God. And so it is with these two truths that we understand that God all along had to provide a Messiah, had to provide a Savior. Now, I think I told you a few weeks ago, but I'm going to use this illustration again because it's really useful to know this. There's some very I mean, the truth is that there's good peoples of every race, but of course there are good people of the Jewish ancestry as well, and people that are good people who do good things in the world. And I think one of those people is Dennis Prager. He started out in the 1970s rescuing people from communist countries, and then over time became a radio personality. Well, he was on a podcast with some Christians, and I can look it up, it's public on YouTube. He said, I always shock my Christian friends when I tell them that we do earn our salvation through works. So Orthodox Jews believe that to this day, that they're going to justify themselves to God through the law. And that's an error, and it's a reason why Jews need Jesus just like we do. Because they're still trusting in something that God has already put the cap on. Something that never justified to begin with anyway. And so I think it's really important to understand that all along, the law showed that we could do it and that we would need Jesus. Even Moses said, look to him who is like me to come. It's one of the last things he said in Deuteronomy, which was the second giving of the law to the next generation of Israel that he was about to pass on to Joshua. So all along, it was to look ahead. And that's why we have prophecies throughout the Old Testament. I'm always confused how you can have 300 prophecies about a Messiah and you just ignore them. I mean, you effectively have to, if you're an Orthodox Jew. Because all along the Old Testament, both the law and the prophets were saying, look to he who is to come, and then they don't. So how does that work? And I'm not trying to pick on the Jews, that's not my point. It's just that it doesn't matter if we're talking about the Jewish law, the law of Moses, or our own law, or any other law. We can't be justified by it. We can only be condemned by it. Have you ever received in your life a certificate in the mail from the government that said, congratulations, you didn't break any laws this month? No, the law never celebrates. The law only condemns. That's the way it works. All right, would somebody read verse 15?
For the law brings about wrath.
Okay, thank you, Rosalie. So condemnation exists because law exists. Now, this is something nobody actually argues. In fact, one of the many crazy movements in our times today is this idea, well, maybe we shouldn't have any laws, any government whatsoever. Just complete anarchy. Well, you can imagine how that would work. It would just be a power play at that point. Whoever has the most power rules everything. And no, there's no protection for anybody. And it's each man for his own. And, you know, to some people, I'm sure that sounds like fun. It does not sound like fun to me. But the truth is, we know this from the book of Romans, chapter 13, which we'll get to, that God has actually established governments and laws. And those things are meant to exist, even though they are inevitably corruptible. And so I think it's useful to know that God set this in order on purpose, that condemnation exists because law exists, and he established law. I mean, even in the Garden of Eden, there was a law, right? What was the law? Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yeah. Gabriel this morning is in New Boston preaching a sermon just on that today. And one thing that him and I talked about when we were writing that together was that there's this myth in our modern world that if society was better, then people would be better. And you hear this all the time. Well, you know, if things were more just, if everybody was, you know, there was no unfairness, there was no biases, that there was no inequality, then that would create better people. Well, the Bible disproves that in the second story of the whole Bible. Because the first story is creation, and the second story is Adam and Eve in the garden. When Adam and Eve are in the garden, isn't everything perfect? Isn't everything equal? Don't they have shelter and food and health care? And I mean, they have everything given to them. All they have is two jobs. Tend that garden and name the animals. And there's only one rule. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Did perfect circumstances make them better people? No. They still had choice. Yep.
What? So what did they have to do to tend the garden if there wasn't any weeds? What did they say? I just went out.
Well, I imagine there was still a harvest. Yeah, animals do. Yeah, that's true.
Some of them,
I don't know. We're guessing, of course.
yeah.
You know what though? Let's actually play on that for a second. So they had a job, but it was really easy. And people think that too. They think, well, if my job was really easy, then my life would be so much easier. Well, actually, have you ever had a really easy job? Because I have. It's so boring. Oh my goodness! When I worked at the library, I like to read. Ugh. No, so boring. Hardee's was an upgrade, and Hardee's was hard. You know, you're on your feet, you're running around, you're dealing with the public. It's greasy and hot. Hardee's was an upgrade. Time flew at Hardee's. So what we think we want everything given to us. We think we want ease in every area of our life, but the truth is when we get it, we'll screw it up. Adam and Eve did, and here's the thing, Adam and Eve were perfect. You and I, we aren't. I already have sin in my life. So, yeah, it's a myth that if society was better, it would make better people. Now, I'm not arguing that society should be terrible, okay? I'm just simply saying that just because we make things more equal or more just doesn't necessarily create better people. In fact, sometimes you have the opposite. You get senses of entitlement and complacency. It's not true for everybody, but it does happen. And so we just simply have this myth that the Bible dispels from the very beginning. And God's law, I mean, if you think about the law of Moses, he did not give an imperfect law. It was a perfect law, but even a perfect law to his own chosen people could not save them, and it didn't. Now, I want to compare something here. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. This was pointed out to me years ago, and I just think it's kind of brilliant. Compare what happened when the law was given versus the start of the church. Now, I read this again last night to make sure I got my facts straight. In Exodus chapter 19, you have the people of Israel arriving at Mount Sinai from Egypt. So they're about to be given the law of Moses, okay? Or the law of God. They call it the law of Moses later. It's actually a pretty scary scene if you've read it in Exodus chapter 19. There's smoke and there's fire and there's thunder, and it actually says the people were terrified. Now, the whole reason why God did that is because what is the beginning of wisdom? Now, they just saw what God did to the Egyptians. Okay? You think that they would have in their heads, hey, this is a really powerful God, and he just saved us, and look at the devastation he's able to render. How about we toe the line? Right? Well, to re-emphasize that point, God has this display of power at Mount Sinai, and the people are scared, right? Well, Moses goes on the mountain, you remember, to get the law inscribed on tablets. And he's gone for 40 days. What did the children of Israel do in that 40 days? Yeah, they built an idol, started worshiping it. And people think, well, you know, because I've had various friends who aren't necessarily religious say, why does God care? Well, it's because of what they did as a result of worshiping that idol. And that's the thing people need to understand. When you are, in the Bible, when it talks about idolatry, it's not just a matter of bowing down to a golden statue, for example. It's the behavior that you engage in to do so. There's open orgies. I'm not trying to be gross. I'm just putting it out there. There's complete lasciviousness. There's a lack of law. There's total chaos and debauchery. And if you read in Exodus chapter 33, when Moses came down, he witnessed all those things. And he took that statue, ground it up, put it in the water, and made them drink it. It's like, you want gold? You can have gold. Just not the way you want it, not the way you think you have it. Well, as a result of their actions, 3,000 people died. Yeah, 3,000 people died. So I want you to think about this. When the giving of the law happened, 3,000 people died. But when the gospel was given in Acts chapter 2, how many people were saved? 3,000. So would you rather live under law or live under grace? Yeah. Yeah. So when I was pointed out to me, I thought, man, another reason why I'm glad to be on this side of the cross. You know, and because there's a lot of laws in the Old Testament where you do this or that and you're dead. Like I would kind of wonder, you know, if back then there was like a counter. You complain about the weather so many times, off with your head, you know. So much rather live under grace than under law. All right, thoughts, questions, comments before we continue? Rabbit trails? All the above? All right, let's do verses 16 and 17. Anybody?
Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace, and it may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our Father in the sight of God, in whom he believed. The God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were.
Okay. Jesus makes this same argument, thank you, Mickey, that anybody can be a child of Abraham. I think he even says rocks can be children of Abraham. And he's being sarcastic when he says that. But the whole reason why he says this is if you think just being a descendant of Abraham is going to save you, you're wrong, because we're all descendants of Abraham. Now, we may not be descendants of Abraham through lineage, but each of us can be descendants of Abraham through faith, because that's what that's the important part about Abraham is faith. It's not important. It's not important if you're circumcised. It's not important about any outward sign. It's about whether or not you obey God in the time and place you are in. That's what matters. And Paul also makes this argument later on in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians when he says that circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Obeying God is what counts. Now, it is very interesting in Genesis chapter 12 because when God first comes to Abraham and presents to him the plan that he wants him to do, he does say, you're going to be a father of many nations. Well, it's almost like if you're a Jew at this time, you're forgetting the fact that Abraham was the father of many nations, not just one. Now, there's one we primarily talk about, but he's also the father of the Arabs, father of other groups, Semitic groups. I mean, to this day they fight. And so you can't make an argument just from lineage. And that's Paul's point here. And you got to imagine that Paul, being a former Jew and a former Pharisee, he's like, how did I not see this? How was I so blind to these truths that are so self-evident? But what happens, of course, in any culture, sometimes even family, sometimes just our own heads, is that we get stuck in our own circular logic. We get stuck in our own ways. We don't ever listen to anybody else. I think that's why to this day, if you talk to person A, they'll say their favorite news source is this, and person B, their favorite news source is this, and they never communicate. I'm telling you, as a Christian minister who really is trying to win people to the Lord, I can't afford not to listen to the other side. I have to know what they're thinking to have any hope at all in reaching them. And also, listening is an extremely powerful evangelistic tool. I usually ask people, would you just tell me what you believe? I just want to hear it. And I promise I won't interrupt. That's something else I always say too. I promise I won't interrupt. Just let them get it out there. I've had people convince themselves they were wrong by just speaking it out loud. Because, and it's kind of self-evident. Because when it's only in your head, you can justify it. But when you actually have to tell it to another human being, you're like, oh, that does sound kind of stupid, doesn't it? I do the same thing. One of the reasons why I practice Sunday school lessons, sermons, and other things that I do is because I try to filter out the stupid. It's going to come out. Sometimes it still comes out anyway. You all know that. But I try to get it out ahead of time, try to go over things ahead of time so that the ideas that sound good in my head but aren't actually good ideas get filtered out. That's something I encourage the preacher boys to do as well. You should practice a sermon 2 or 3 times at least. Because every time you're going to add this or subtract that. And you just, have a pen in the pulpit and just do it as you go. And, that's just the way that human being, bad or good information. And so I'm sure when Paul was writing this here, he was almost smiling to himself, like, "Yep, this was me. I made that error once." I'm sure
But
Paul.
she had to relate.
Yeah.
He relates those that he was speaking to, because
Right. Yeah, totally. I'll tell you a little happy story. So, this is an adult class, so we can talk about this. But heard from Zach this week, and he was talking about how he was given a tablet. They give him tablets in prison now. That's how they communicate. That's how you send and receive messages. They don't actually let you receive physical mail anymore because people were spraying letters with drugs. So it's all electronic now. And what's cool is, and I thought this was awesome, somebody out there, whoever it is, God bless them, pays a fee, a pretty substantial fee, to put a Christian streaming app on the tablet. So every single inmate has access to this streaming service for free. And it's sermons and Christian television shows and just and Bibles. And so he's really been able to benefit from that. So I just thought that was really awesome. And there was a certain sermon he ran into where it was a youth minister who used to be an addict. And he said it was just so inspiring. Because that's his goal now. He wants to go into youth ministry. And you can tell if you've been around him, he's perfect for that. And so, God works through these mysterious ways and mysterious places to do good things. So, he says he's tried to call me, but I have not been able to get a phone call from him. But at least we can message. So that's something. Yeah. If you want to write him, let me know, and I'll show you how to do it via your computer or phone.
I think we're going to put the address in the bulletin.
Okay, that'll work. Okay, cool. So grateful for that. All right. Let's see what else we have in these verses here. Okay, now this is something else I wanted to bring up. It says here, in the presence of him who he believed, even God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. Faith is a funny thing like this. It can not exist in somebody's life. And then, through a combination of the Holy Spirit and a person's personal choice, faith then exists. It's not a material thing. It's a choice that God himself has given us, if we so want to take it. And that can result in us obeying him, following his terms of salvation, coming into a saving relationship with him. This reminds me of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. If you remember the beginning of Acts chapter 10, Cornelius was a devout man, a generous man, a man who loved God, and yet he was not saved. Did you ever notice this? He was not saved at the beginning of Acts chapter 10. God sent Peter and his entourage to show him how to be saved. So if you want to talk about faith being, a mental assent, Cornelius already had that. You want to talk about being generous, he already had that. You want to talk about being devout, he already had that. And yet, he still had to do other things that God told him he had to do. Works of God, not works of man. He still had to hear the gospel and respond to it like anybody else. And I think that point is missed by a lot of people. And that's why I think it's so important. We have the book of Acts because it gives us examples of what these doctrinal books tell us. When we hear the teaching, I want to see a how-to video. That's the book of Acts. For example, when I was taking apart my car yesterday to replace my struts, I read instructions, but then I also watched videos. It's extraordinarily useful to have both, isn't it? If you can see somebody do it and read the instructions, and even then, it still took me 7 hours to change out 2 struts because I'd never done it before. But I did it. And I feel like that's a lot of people's journey to Christ, is that they're reading or they're hearing, and they see it, and all of that finally comes into play, and they realize, okay, these are the works of God that I must do. I'm seeking, but seeking isn't enough. You actually have to obey his terms. He set them out there. All right, any thoughts, questions, or comments on that? At the bottom of your sheet, I wanted to point out this to you. we have a lineage in the Old Testament for Jesus. And you might just want to say the bottom part of your sheet there, because this is just so useful to know. If you want to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, one way you can do that is through the Old Testament, because no scholar alive believes that the Old Testament was written after Jesus came. Every single one of them, even the liberal ones, believe that it was written before Jesus came. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have a lot to do with that proof. Now, some of them will say, well, Daniel was written only 100 years before Christ or something like that. Well, okay, for the sake of argument, fine. It's still before Christ, and he still predicts Christ. So that's pretty impressive, isn't it? So some of the major prophecies that you can look at when it comes to proving that Jesus is the Christ is you can start in Genesis 12:3, where Jesus would come from a Hebrew. The first Hebrew named in Scripture was Abram or Abraham. In that particular verse, it talks about. Yeah. But the point is that Jesus would come from a Hebrew. Jesus would come through Abraham. The name Jew did not come until later, when Jacob and his sons established the nation of Israel. And then Jesus would come through the Jewish tribe of Judah. That's Genesis 49:10, the beginning of that verse. That's why I have A there. And then he would come through the family of Jesse. We know this from Isaiah 11, verses 1 and 10. And then through the house of David, Zechariah 12:10. Born to a virgin, Isaiah 7:14. At a time when a king not of Judah was sitting on the throne, Genesis 49:10, verse B. So you put all of those things in order, and you can ask yourself, okay, who in history matches this description? And this is just a handful of prophecies. The class I'm going to teach at Summit in November, I'm going to go through maybe up to 50 of them in about 10 hours. And the whole point is that you would ask yourself, okay, who in history fits these descriptions, or who today fits these descriptions? Well, the only person who can fit all these descriptions is Jesus. And so you can go through this line, and you can funnel out and figure out who the Messiah is. And it has to be Christ. One of the other things I'm going to talk about in my class in November is that there's this one other historical character from Arabia called Sayashant. That was his name. And he loosely fits about 15 of the 660 prophecies, or I'm sorry, the 330 prophecies about Jesus. Loosely about 15. You got to be pretty creative to get there. So if the second most likely character in history is 15 out of 330, or Jesus, which is 330 out of 330, who are you going to think is the Messiah? Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not even a contest. There's not even a second place, okay? If somebody ran, let's say an Olympic race 20 times faster than the second place person, would you be talking much about the second place person? Not really. When I was in junior high, there was a girl named Hannah, and she would run laps around all of us. Like, I remember coming in second in a mile race, and she was almost all the way around the track one more time. I guarantee you they were not talking about me. Everybody was talking about Hannah, because that girl could run. Well, all the same, the reason why we talk about Christ and not Shayasant is because he falls drastically short. And so, again, you put all these facts about Jesus from the Old Testament, and you just ask yourself, man, if they were making this up, that's a mathematical impossibility. It's not an improbability, it's an impossibility. You reach a certain point in math where you recognize it's never going to happen. And that's evolution too. But for the sake of our argument here, we're talking about the coming of Christ. If it wasn't divine, it never would have happened. But it did happen. And there's only one way to explain that, if you're being honest. The truth is that if the Bible was subject to the same historical standards that other historical records were subject to, it would win so far off, again, there wouldn't be a second place. We believe things about history. You and I believe conventional facts about history. We only have like one little bitty source from one little scrap of paper from 500 years after it happened. That's the truth. Archaeology, a lot of it's based on just a single tooth that they found, and they built this giant structure around it, and they're like, see, look at that. That's what it is. I have a friend who has a master's degree in archaeology. She's loved paleontology and all that since she was really young. And she went into that field, And she honestly walked away with it. After about 10 years, she realized it's mostly a fraud. She doesn't do it anymore. She works in IT. There's really one goal if you're hired as an archaeologist nowadays, and that is not to find things. Let me give you an example. A business wants to build on a certain piece of land. They hire you to go into that land to see if there's any like Indian burial stuff there or something like that. Believe me, if you want to stay hired, you don't find it. She's like, when she came to realize that, she's like, this whole industry is a fraud. Now, I'm not saying there aren't, legitimate archaeologists, but again, history is a lot of what you think of as fact in history. Again, we have one little source from 300 years after it happened, and we just accept it as fact. The Bible, we have so much evidence, it's absolutely overwhelming. We actually have real archaeology that supports the Bible. We have history. We have multiple witnesses. We have more manuscript evidence of the Bible than even Shakespeare. And Shakespeare was written 1,600 years after the last page of the New Testament was written. And it's not even close. It's like 10 times the manuscript evidence for the Bible. And so again, if you really want fact, if you really want proof, I just say get out of the way of the Bible. Nothing beats it. Sometimes I hear Christian apologists on podcasts, the radio, trying to defend God through logical arguments and science and all that. And that's fine. That has its place. But I think that if you just stuck to Scripture, you can't go wrong. Man-made arguments can be argued against. You can argue about the science. We did that for the last 4 years. You can argue about human logic. What you can't argue against is the Word of God. Good luck. Just point out what's in here. It'll prove itself. Get out of the way of the lion, is the way I put it. The lion doesn't need you to defend it. You just need to let it loose. People can argue with Josh Stuckey all day long. People can prove me wrong all day long. They can't prove the Word of God wrong. You want to argue against Christ and the Apostle Paul, go back. Good. Thoughts, questions, comments?
So where did Cornelius get his knowledge?
I believe it says that he learned it from Jews. He was a Gentile, of course, but I believe he learned it from the Jews and was trying to live the best life he knew how to live. But God knew he needed more and sent Peter and his entourage to teach him more. Oh, you're way far away.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was brought to my attention that Holocaust never happened.
Right. Yeah. And think about that. We still have people alive today who witnessed it.
Exactly.
And we question that. Yeah. So that just goes to show you, people will run away from fact. I mean, they just will. Yeah. Good luck with that. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. All right. Other questions, comments, or otherwise? Because otherwise, I got through my lesson and we're done 5 minutes early, so you're welcome. No promises for the sermon, though. I'm feeling 45, 50 hours. All right. Very good. Jake, would you close us out in prayer?
Dear God, thank you for this wonderful day that you brought us. I thank you for the lesson that Josh Cheek has taught us today, and I hope that we all have safe travels and have a great service today. And I have a good week, and then you have a
How are the Colemans? How you feeling? Yeah? All right. When's the due date? Oh my goodness. It's like right around the corner. You guys look surprisingly awake. Oh, I'm sorry. That's miserable. Yeah, I bet you do. But you're faking it well. Good job.
Yeah.